talking about Purim being almost over, some people are still celebrating. We'll note Tzipora mentioned that she probably wouldn't be here because she was going to a late Purim Suda, but she did remind me, what is today all around the world? It's only Shushan Purim in some places.
Women's International
Women's Day. Does that not prove the existence of God, that on a holiday that is paying tribute to Esther and maybe even Vashti, that is International Women's Day? That's something to ponder. Marilyn.
And I have to say, it was great happiness that my mother is her birthday's today, and she's 101.
Yay. Oh my God.
Mazel tov.
Simon Tov,
Very,
Mazel
very
Tov,
blessed
Mazel Tov, Simon Tov, Mazel Tov. That's wonderful.
Unfortunately, I can't be there with her today, but we're going to celebrate when I get back in a couple of weeks. But
I hope you're not there because of this class.
No, in Florida, but
wow.
But we're going back shortly. But that's really wonderful. Special. She's good. She's good. We spoke to her this morning.
Do you remember? Did I tell this recently? When it was decided women could have aliyot, do you remember who the first woman was? Betty Rumper.
Oh.
She turned 100
Oh.
that day, and she was given the aliyah. And on that Shabbat. And Batya and I go home, and Batya had a friend with her. I don't remember how many years ago that was, but it was a while ago. And they take out a board game. And you know what it says on the game between, so one of them, I don't remember if it was Batya or Molly, who said, oh, Betty wouldn't be able to play because it said between 9 and 99. Anyway, she was quite a lady. And may your mother enjoy more good years from her wonderful family. Okay. So it was a lovely day. Yes, Nachama.
I just wanted to share, I work in a pediatric children's rehabilitation hospital. And I went to work today so that my staff could be with their children. And so I was there. And I think that one of the highlights of the day for me, not being at a Suda, one of the highlights for me was being in such a wonderfully giving atmosphere. Usually we talk about Aline as being a kind of microcosm of Israeli society, in that it has every kind of person that you can imagine. Half the hospital is Arabs, patients and staff, religious, secular, you name it. And people were giving out mishloach manot. Children, Haredi children, came to my staff who were in the clinic areas. And the two girls working today with me were two Arab girls. One doesn't look Arab, but the other one is very visibly Arab. And if I could have taken pictures of the children giving the mishloach manot also to the Arabs and saying bevakasha, and they're responding with toda, the Arab children receiving, the Jewish children receiving. I'm not being overly dramatic. It was just a beautiful moment, because that's all it is. It's a moment, but we have to cling to those moments. And it was just very, very special. I just wanted to share that.
Thank you. Much more meaningful than me talking about whether chickens in Israel are better than the ones. Another moving moment, and then we'll begin. I caught on TV today. You remember last week we bemoaned the murder of two brothers last Sunday, a 21-year-old and a 19-year-old. Well, today on TV, two people were being interviewed. And who were these two people? They were recipients of the corneas, 2 of 4 people who received the corneas of these 2 brothers. And the interviewer, when speaking with one of them, Ronnie Carmel, I think 66, he was tearing. And the parents of these 2 boys were also there. And she asked him, are you tearing because of the procedure, the transplant, or is it because having listened to the parents? And he said, right now it's because of the parents, because it was incredible listening to them. And first of all, being able to talk only a week later, but also saying how happy they were that these 4 people will have the ayin tova, the good eye that their sons had. Now that expression, good eye, doesn't mean just physically, but it's a term used in our tradition and in Pirkei Avot for somebody who looks at things with joy, who looks at things and isn't jealous. And they're thrilled, they said, that their eyes will still be functioning through these 4 messengers. What else can I say? So we leave Purim, but I think you'll see that we're not entirely leaving some of the messages of Purim as we proceed into Pesach. One other thing, this holiday spirit, or the sense of holidays, one holiday finishing and another one soon approaching, people at the table also talked about the fact that tomorrow you'll go into a supermarket and you'll see at the entrance, not the Purim items, but you'll already see cleaning items for the upcoming holiday of Pesach, which we are beginning to talk about now. And that's one of the beauties here of seeing it all around you and being able to tell what is happening in our calendar. So to get us into our subject, let me ask you, and I would very much appreciate some responses. There are no right or wrong answers here. Which part of the Haggadah, the text of the Seder, comes to your mind when somebody asks you that very question? What do you think of first, without thinking too much? What's the first part of the Seder or text that you think about? And please just say it.
The 4 questions.
Okay, I guess we're gonna have to, 4 children. Okay.
Hallel.
Sarah, the 4 questions. What else? David.
The escape from oppression in Egypt,
Okay.
which has so many, which is so true in our time. The escape from Russia, from here, from there.
The
5 rabbis, the 5 rabbis.
5 rabbis. Okay, sitting in B'nai Brak.
Right.
Anybody else?
Hallel.
Hallel. Yefet. Great songs.
The singing in the order at the beginning.
Okay. Kadesh Urchatz.
The plagues.
The plagues.
The very first Dam Sephardeia. Those words, yep, that's the first thing that I think of.
Dam Sfardea. Okay, you know that.
The commandment of remembering the Maror.
Maror.
Pesach, Maror Pesach.
Okay. Anybody else?
Our link for 150 generations to our ancestors, a continuous link.
You're first, Stephen. Okay. Anybody else? Okay. So.
And also when you say next year in Jerusalem.
Ah, okay. Shana haba. All right, keep that in mind. Remember everything people said, and then I'll tell you what you didn't say. Okay, now let's play a little word association. When you hear the word slave, one word, most two words, what do you think of? Associated with being a slave.
Oppression.
Okay. Anybody else? Nobody else? Come on. Egypt. Okay.
I think of the difference between slaves and then in our ancestors' days, how we treated slaves compared to more modern times, how other nations treat their slaves, or we didn't treat our slaves as slaves, we treated them as servants with respect.
Okay, we could get into that, but not now, but because ultimately we said slavery is not a good idea. But I know what you're saying, Stephen. Anybody else?
We were once slaves.
So you think, okay, what you're saying, you think of the fact that we should acknowledge we were, okay? And that's something we're meant to think about, not just on Pesach, but every day, as we say Kriyat Shema.
Their escape
The
to
Torah
freedom.
also says, that we are slaves to Hashem.
Yefet, a different kind of slavery. Thank you, Claudette, I see. Okay, thank you. Marilyn?
I said their escape to freedom.
Ah, okay. Now, only because we know the story that we can say that when we think of slaves, we think of the fact that we escaped to freedom. I saw another hand.
That slavery is not always the physical state, but a mental state.
Okay. It's not just hard work. Right. Thank you, Marlene. David.
During the Holocaust, Jews were lucky if they were enslaved rather than being killed immediately. Jews were basically slaves during the Holocaust, if they were lucky. Usually they weren't lucky, they were shot or gassed immediately.
Very, very interesting.
Yeah.
And we'll come back to that. Okay.
Hopelessness.
Okay, Michael. Thank you. Okay, now, on the other side of it, when you hear, and I don't want just opposites, but when you hear of a free person, a free man, a free woman, what do you think of?
Democracy.
Okay.
Happiness.
Happiness. Okay. Anything else?
Responsibility.
Responsibility. Interesting answer. Why, Stephen?
Because freedom doesn't mean you can just do anything that you choose to do. You have to have respect for others, first for yourself and your family, and be responsible for your actions.
Good. We're going to come back to that as well.
Freedom of
Anybody
religion.
else?
The Arab Spring in Egypt, they thought, oh, we're free now. Well, look how it's turned out. With freedom without responsibility is of no value.
Okay. Something that you have when you're free is to make choices. A slave does exactly what he's told. Okay. Anybody else?
Freedom of religion.
Okay.
And
All right.
also, yeah, that's true.
Oh.
Okay, somebody is saying writing independence.
Go.
Okay. Anybody else? Okay, it was important that I hear these responses to get us into our subject, but also, just as I did with Purim, I think I wanted to highlight some elements, issues that we don't necessarily think about when we think of this holiday that we get dressed up in ridiculous fashions, though some people are very creative. And that's what I'd like to do today with Pesach. I was hoping, to be quite honest, that nobody would mention a text that we're going to spend time on today. Because I don't think we give this text the significant prominence that it deserves, because it's probably one of the most important messages of the transition from being avadim, slaves, and then being b'nei chorin, free people. And what is this text? Now that I've said that, does anybody want to guess what this text is? Okay. I don't know whether you would, but here we go. Okay. So here it is. Toward the beginning, and that's important that I'm saying toward the beginning of the Seder, we recite or sing Halach Ma'anya. And what are we saying as we pronounce either in Hebrew, this happens to be in Aramaic, or in English? I'm saying that as an aside, but you know, it is very important. And the rabbi said this: if you have people who don't understand Hebrew, then you recite things in the language that people will understand, or else it's just a trivial exercise. So that's just an aside. Now, this is in Aramaic. Let's read it. And I'm sure some of you, if not all, know what this is. This is the bread of affliction that our ancestors in Egypt ate. Everyone who is hungry should come and eat. Everyone who needs something should come and participate in the Passover meal. This year we are here. Next year we will be in Israel. This year we are slaves. Next year we will be free. What is this paragraph? It is an invitation. Now, times have changed. When this was written, the common language of Jews was Aramaic. And if it was an invitation, a sincere invitation for people to come to your Seder, then of course you say it in a language that they'll understand. Now, when I say times are different, we don't anymore usually leave our doors open and just ask anybody to come in. But in those days, it might seem very last minute, but if there were people not having a place to go for the Seder, it was an invitation for them to come. Now, we are meant to invite people, and there are those who invite people from different communities. Such Jaius arranges that, you know, somebody who's come either today from the Ukraine, so that everyone can be at a Seder. But beyond that, what is the significance? And I'm submitting that I think it is very, very significant of this invitation. Now, let's take a close look. There are 3 parts to this text. What are the 3 parts? Look at it again on your own and tell me what makes up this invitation. 3 parts.
What about food?
It's about food, that's for sure. And don't minimize the importance of that. But in the first part, what are we expressing? Sharing a memory. We remember that this was the bread, lechem oni, that our ancestors ate in Egypt. What's the second part? Now that I've told you the first.
Share it with the needy.
Okay, you're taking an action, you're inviting people to come. And the last part, a hope. Now, what is the difference between everyone who is hungry and everyone who needs something? It's not just being redundant. What is the difference?
Hungry implies, I think, hungry for food, whereas when you need something, it might be companionship or love of a group, or ending your loneliness. So it's something not with food.
Exactly. That there can be people who would have food at a Seder, but they don't have people to be with at the Seder. And this is how we concluded last week. The importance of reaching out, whether it was through Matanot Levyanim or Mishloach Manot. And we looked at Mordechai and Esther as being a paradigm of caring for one another. And this thought is continued here. But it's a little different than the sentence in the Megillah that says, Ish l'reyehu, let one person give to another. And you'll see what I mean in a moment. Now, what is the basis for this invitation beyond being hospitable and being welcoming? Something that reflects one of the biggest changes from being a slave in Egypt to the night before they make that escape, the Exodus. Let's look at the psukim here, which is the basis for this invitation. So God says to Moshe, speak to the entire community of Israel, saying, on the 10th of this month, let each one take a lamb for each parental home, a lamb for each household. But if the household is too small for a lamb, then he and his neighbor who is nearest to his house shall take one according to the number of people, each one according to one's ability to eat, shall you be counted for the lamb. This is something that could not have happened while they were slaves. When they were slaves, there was no such thing as a family unit in the way that we know it. There was no such thing as the father being the head of the household. This was one of the first things that God commands, that you are now going to eat as a family with others. And so when you eat this lamb, it's as a family. Now, even more convincing of the point I want to arrive at is in the Talmud, the Korban Pesach. Usually, a korban, a sacrifice, was given as an individual. The Korban Pesach, the Paschal sacrifice, should be slaughtered only for the sake of those who were enumerated for partaking of it, as it says in Exodus 13. Everyone should be enumerated on the lamb. Everybody's going to have a part of it. The implication is that one should be enumerated on it while it is alive. the important line now. Those enumerated on a paschal sacrifice are referred to as the members of the company. Now, what does it say in the Hebrew? B'nei chavura. We all know what a chavura is. All right, a group of people, from the shoresh, a friend. What it is highlighting in here, and Rambam picks up on this, is the need to make that transformation from just being an individual, and that's what you were as a slave, even though you were dehumanized, but you were alone. Family didn't mean what it means to us, unfortunately. And they are now being told and urged by God to make the transition from that solitarianess to being united with others. Now, that's no small transition. And this invitation, even if it doesn't seem totally legitimate that we're already sitting at the Seder and it's not the very first thing we do at the Seder, then is it really a sincere invitation? What's the point? There are a few things that we still do today that remind us, first of all, of a time a long time ago and what the Jews at the Seder used to do. But more importantly, it is an opportunity to realize that one of the key messages of the Seder is being unified both with people that are around us today and unified with the people from before us, as Stephen mentioned, with all the generations, Now, what is strange, I just said that the Halach Ma'anya isn't even the very first thing that we recite. It's after we've already made Kiddush. And that's a bit strange. Why? Now, let's look. Dr. Don Seaman says the following. According to the commentator Netziv, and God appeared to Abraham. Remember when Abraham has been circumcised in his old age, but he's still sitting outside his tent. And the text has it that he's with God. And we're shocked that when these three men, whom he doesn't know are angels, appear, that he kind of says to God, can you wait a minute? Okay, that's the context of this. According to the Netziv, and God appeared to Abraham, means that Avram was engaged at that time in spiritual pursuits. He was perhaps davening. He was communing with God. Maybe he was even contemplating the depths of Torah. But when three wanderers appeared, and in the shadow of the opportunity to perform a mitzvah, like Hachnasat Orchim, hospitality, Abraham knew that he had to put his communion with God aside, as it were, in order to fulfill the halakha. The reception of guests is greater than the reception of the Shekhinah, God's presence. Jews like Abraham, who are committed to the divine word, for Jews like these in particular, the chance to do a mitzvah for another person must sometimes paradoxically take precedence over any religious experience, even the most profound and authentic. It is one level to see God in the face of the other, and another level entirely to understand that one must sometimes take leave of God in order to the care for the other. Greater, as it says in Masachet Shabbat, greater is the welcoming of guests than the welcoming of the Shekhinah. Some of you might recall from, I guess, over a year ago when we talked about Daniela Hartman's book, Putting God Second. One of its points was that if you're going to ignore vulnerable people because you feel like you have to, just to put it this way, continue davening, that wouldn't make sense to God himself. Okay. So pointing out here how important, and it's a precedent, Avram, of us reaching out to people. Okay, now, Jonathan Sachs, Alav Shalom, confirms how very significant this text is and why I said before that it reflects the transformation of being a slave to a free person. Think about the act of sharing and opening your home to someone else. And this is what he says. Sharing food is the first act through which slaves become free human beings. One who fears tomorrow, as a slave does not offer his bread to others, but one who is willing to divide his food with a stranger has already shown himself to be capable of fellowship and faith, the two things from which hope is born. I think Michael referred to hopelessness as a slave. That is why we begin the Seder by inviting others to join us. Bread shared is no longer the bread of oppression. You know, matzah has two sides to it. It represents two things. It is that lechem oni, the bread of affliction, oppression, but it also symbolizes that that's what represents their freedom because they were in a hurry and they ate that as they escaped. Reaching out to others, giving help to the needy, and companionship to those who are alone, we bring freedom into the world, and with freedom, God. Rav Joseph Soloveitchik will continue this thought in something that's actually very interesting. Judaism apparently considers marriage. You know, if you were a slave beforehand, fine. But once you were a slave and you weren't married, you weren't to get married. Now think about this. Judaism apparently considers marriage not only a sociological institution, but also a metaphysical, existential community. To marry means to cut down the barriers that separate individuals from each other, to substitute for egocentricity and self-concern, which qualify as slave, and he's not guilty because of that, the bright spaces of joy and spiritual experience. Marriage is supposed to precipitate the transition from an individual to a communal existence. Only people who recognize themselves as created in God's image, and how often can a slave do that? People who transcend themselves, who are capable of thinking in terms of others, in terms of an existence above and beyond their natural one, only they are able to perform the forward movement, to surge toward another person, extend their concerns, and create a covenantal community, a marriage. The slave is in fear of his life and always ready to flee. And that fright extinguishes every moral feeling within his person. He cannot give himself to others. He does not care for them and considers everyone his enemy. He protects himself. Now, can we blame whether it's the slave in Egypt or, as David mentioned, the slaves in the Holocaust? So the key transition from being a slave to a free person is, of course, being able to make choices. And that takes a lot of getting used to. And then having that responsibility that Stephen mentioned. But it's being open to others. And that is a message that we need to be reminded of. And that's why immediately after Purim, we are with this message of Pesach. And as I said a moment ago, we don't just remind ourselves that we were slaves. Somebody mentioned that earlier with the word association. But anybody who says Shema a couple of times a day is reminded of that we were slaves. And that it's expected of us, because we were slaves, we know what it's like, and that we will try to move forward in reaching out genuinely to others. Now, a number of Haggadot, there are so many editions of Haggadot, bring in Primo Levi, an Italian Jew, chemist, partisan, and an incredible writer of fiction and nonfiction in his autobiographies, who survived the horrors of Auschwitz, an Italian born in 1917 and died in 1987. And I want us to take a look at some of his words, almost to concretize, not almost, to concretize the suggestion of how significant the phenomenon of sharing is to a free person. So, these are some of the things that he says in his book, which must be read. Precisely because the lager, the camp, was a great machine to reduce us to beasts, we must not become beasts. and there's a difference between not sharing and being a beast, that even in this place, one can survive. It's interesting, he wrote this autobiography after the experience, but he writes it as if he's there. And it was first published in 1947, and not many wanted to read it. When it was republished, 1957, then people were more open to reading about this horror. Interesting. Okay. Let me read again. Precisely because the lager was a great machine to reduce us to beasts, we must not become beasts, that even in this place one can survive. And therefore one must want to survive. Why? To tell the story, to bear witness, and that to survive, we must force ourselves to save at least the skeleton, the scaffolding, the form of civilization. We were slaves, deprived of every right, exposed to every insult, and this is reflecting what David said earlier, condemned to certain death, but we still possess one power, and we must defend it with all our strength, for it is the last, the power to refuse our consent. So we must certainly wash our faces with soap and dirty water and dry ourselves on our jackets. We must polish our shoes, not because the regulation states it, but for dignity and propriety. We must walk erect without dragging our feet, not in homage to Prussian discipline, but to remain alive and not to begin to die. The conviction that life has a purpose is rooted in every fiber of man. It is a property of the human substance. Free men give many names to this purpose and think and talk a lot about its nature. But for us, the question is simpler. Today in this place, our only purpose is to reach the spring. At the moment, we care about nothing else. Here, the struggle to survive is with respect, because everyone is desperately and ferociously alone. We are aware that this is very distant from the picture that is usually given of the oppressed who unite, if not in resistance, at least in suffering. He's actually contrasted with Elie Wiesel, alav shalom, who talked of solidarity. He sees it differently. We do not deny that this may be possible when oppression does not pass a certain limit, or perhaps when the oppressor, through inexperience or magnanimity, tolerates or favors it. But now, this is why I bring this. He describes that transition that we talk of when we bring halachmania, and he describes the following. According to him, the 10 days after the Nazis ran away in 1945 from the concentration camp, those were the hardest days, because for 10 days they were left alone with scraps of food and practically no fuel. But something suddenly happens, and he describes this as such. When the broken window was repaired and the stove began to spread its heat, something seemed to relax in everyone. And at that moment, Tararowski, a Franco-Pole of 23 with typhus, proposed to the others that each of them offer a slice of bread to us three who had been working. And so it was agreed. Only a day before, a similar event would have been inconceivable. The law of the lager, concentration camps, said, eat your own bread, and if you can, that of your neighbor, and left no room for gratitude. It really meant that the law of the lager was dead. It was the first human gesture that occurred among us. I believe that that moment can be dated as the beginning of the change by which we who had not died slowly changed from Haftlinga prisoners to men again. And the Haggadot that I referred to bring this as an example of two things, two types of sharing as a symbol of freedom. Sharing the bread, and then based on this next text, Levi had a recurring dream when he was in the camp, a dream, a nightmare. And he says the following about the dream. It is an intense pleasure, physical, inexpressible, to be at home among friendly people and to have so many things to recount. But I cannot help noticing that my listeners do not follow me. In fact, they are completely indifferent. They speak confusedly of other things among themselves as if I was not there. My sister looks at me, gets up, and goes away without a word. Can you imagine having thoughts like that, whether subconsciously or consciously? It's almost as if he's aware that when he gets out, he's going to want to tell, and that nobody's going to listen. Now, this is the second kind of sharing and reason that he is brought into the Haggadot. Because not only do we share our food, but of course, the Haggadah, tell our story, my story. And that's how you have to tell it, as if it's your story, or else nobody's going to be interested. And that's why we say in the Haggadah, this is what happened to me. Now, why did he have this fear? Anyone? Why would he be afraid? Already have it in his heart and mind that nobody would listen as he told the story. Anyone want to suggest why that would be? And I'm not necessarily going to suggest a reason, even though I have some thoughts. Anyone? And I hinted at it perhaps when I said how when it was first published, his book, not too many people were interested. It took a while. Somebody?
Yes, I think that maybe he thought that no one would believe the horror that he went through, that he was making it up.
Okay. Now, why would people think that he was making it up? I think you're right. But why would they think that he was making it up? Because it's so unbelievable?
Yes. Yes, it's no one ever heard of anything like this before.
Anyone else? Thank you.
I think he had a fear that there would be nobody left to listen.
That's what I think. Yeah.
That he was going to come and want to share his story, and there would be nobody left to listen, and those others who had gone through it with him would be experiencing the same thing. There's nobody left.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Hey, I remember last week, it was mentioned that when we talk about remembering Amalek, and this is another possibility, and sometimes people have difficulty in the demand of our tradition to remember such a horrific story, that often it's people are uncomfortable, can't handle listening,
Right.
visualizing such horrors. But we have obviously said that we have to tell, and not just one time, but retell and retell annually. And I'm saying not just annually, but we're reminded every day.
Bracha, we do the same thing at Purim, actually, because when we read the Megillah, we try to blot out the name of Haman because we don't want to hear it anymore. And we don't want others to hear it. He's too horrible a person for us to even think about.
So what do you do with that, though? If we're looking, we don't want to think about him. On the other hand, we want to wipe out any continuation of that. So how do you do that if we don't tell the story?
We're actually commanded to remember it. They said blot out the name, and yet it says at the last sentence, remember it. It's very hard. There's a dichotomy there. You have to blot it out and yet remember it. I think it's sort of a psychological thing we do with ourselves, that we want to blot out really bad memories, yet to really get through them, you have to think about them and contemplate them a little bit more and delve a little bit more into yourself when you're trying to work through that.
Wonderful comment, Marilyn, because you're making what I just said about personalizing, and that the story, you're seeing that you have work to do with this, and that how you relate to these stories says a lot about you and our identity. You know, these stories aren't just stories, but we're meant lirot et atzmeinu, as if they are a part of us. It can't be something that's detached. Yeah.
Rabbi, maybe that is why it says to remember it, because it wants us to remember that we are capable also if we don't watch out for this behavior.
For sure. For sure.
Good point.
Absolutely.
It's
not just a matter of remembering, but it's meant to be absolutely a catalyst for ensuring that we don't act in that same way.
Amen.
We know what it's like. Yeah. I think I heard somebody else wanting to say.
Yeah, it was pretty much what you had said, which I absolutely love it. I love what everyone says, that we have to keep up, continuing our study of Torah, Bible, and our good deeds. Exactly. It's like what you said. So
okay.
I want to throw something else in. I also think that it is often difficult for people to hear because of survivor's guilt, or the fact that we didn't go through it, particularly the generations that were alive during the Holocaust, who were in situations that were more comfortable. I'm sure there's a certain amount of guilt in that.
Brenda, wait, say that again a little about
Okay,
the
I think
guilt.
there's a certain guilty aspect when you look at people who have suffered or are suffering, and you haven't gone through that and have been comfortable. I do think that there's a certain amount of guilt or a sense of, you know, I didn't do something about it, or even there's the other side is there, but for the grace of God go I. And then it's very difficult to hear about what other people have gone through.
Interesting. Yeah.
Bracha, I also think it goes right back to what we were talking about at the beginning of this class about the transition from slavery to freedom. Freedom brings with it not only joy, but it also brings some burdens. The responsibility brings with it a burden, and sometimes though that burden is not easy, and recounting the horrors of the past is sometimes extremely difficult, and remembering them is extremely difficult. But the fact that we have the ability to do that is part of our freedom.
Yeah, excellent. Some people
And
have
they're asked to do
how
something
many
about it.
people, how many people share their entire history also, that you're willing, as we're supposed to, we begin describing our enslavement and then, yes, reaching our freedom. Not everybody is open to that. And of course, it's very psychological, because what it's asking is for you to take a genuine, honest look at yourself and where are you at in this history? And is it something that you are? And the Torah obsesses with this. You can see at least 3 different places that God tells Moshe to say to the people there, you're going to teach this to your children. You're going to tell this to your children, and your children are going to ask. Are we telling the story, or are we shying away from it? And do we feel it as essential to our identity? I'm going to leave the next session because I see next section that I wanted to get into is, so Primo Levi, I'm telling you, reflects the element of sharing, both in physically sharing food and what that represented, but also in telling stories. We are obsessed, our tradition, no one can deny it, with telling and retelling and retelling. And we do that through words, but also rituals. And we also live in an age where sometimes we say, oh, do we really have to spend so much time on these small details? If the details are just details and don't make up, as they say, you know, the forest. On the other hand, Pesach, probably more than any other holiday, pays attention to the smallest of details. And we'll try to see why those details, if they're given meaning, are so important to the telling of this story. And so we will look at next week the cups of wine and what they represent, but we'll also look at a detail such as this. I'll just share one aspect of it. You know, you're not supposed to eat for several hours before the Seder begins. Now somebody can say, why?
That's in the newborn, the first one.
Is it just that you want to appreciate the matzah They haven't tasted it before. No. There's a sense of the Seder is about a reenactment. And if we come to the Seder with a full stomach, then we're already not going to be able to reenact. Now that might sound, what does that mean, really reenact? We want to make it experiential, because if you're just reading about something, that's not going to do it. You have to feel it. You have to feel it. Now, there's no way that we're going to feel like slaves. But these are all pushing us to at least think about it. And by doing some of these details, you get your children and grandchildren to ask. And if they ask, then you get to tell them these stories. The details are not for naught. I will conclude with asking you to complete this sentence. Storytelling requires what? Storytelling requires what?
A listener.
Attention.
Okay. The active participation of both the storyteller and the listener.
Mhm.
Storytelling also requires that you make your subject come alive and be exciting for the listener.
Absolutely. If you tell somebody, your child, your grandchild, there was somebody who on the basketball court did such and such, they might find it interesting. But how will they make it really interesting if they say, I was on that basketball court? And that's making it something that's important to me, and then hopefully will be important to you. But that's a lifetime job, an ongoing job. That this isn't just a ceremony that we do once a year. But the message from the Seder is meant to last us between Seder and Seder. And I don't mean the two Seders in 1 year. I'm sitting here like,
Rabbi, we learn by experiencing things and actually doing them. And I think that is why the Seder is so much active involvement. Be active, then you take it in and you remember it.
take it in. That's a wonderful phrase to close with. We have to take it in. Okay. All right. Thank you for that.
Welcome.
Okay. Anybody else?